Introduced to R. Davis Younts a few years ago because of the yeoman's work he was doing on behalf of military personnel caught up in the purge, when essentially, my belief, the military was using the toxic experimental genetic serums as a means by which to test the total compliance of officers. How far would they be willing to go in a woke military? And if you dared to ask questions and demand that the Uniform Code of Military Justice was actually upheld as written, that was and especially if you did so while invoking a faith in God, then that was a clear sign you probably wouldn't fire on your countrymen if ordered, so you've got to go. At least that's my own opinion. All right. And a lot of people did choose their agency and honor instead of being poisoned, potentially. And the Trump administration has come in guns blazing, promising those people restoration. Pete Hegseth is now fully in charge over at DOD. However, I have received mixed messages in my inbox from military veterans, both pleased and not pleased with what they're seeing on the restoration front thus far. And as we saw the first time Trump was president, it wasn't always that he could get the generals to implement what he wanted as the civilian commander. So as a guy who's been on the front lines of this, I want to get some clarification. Davis, it's good to see you again, brother. And that beard is looking even more epic than the last time I saw you, my friend. Well done. How are you?
I'm doing well. Always an honor. Just thank you for your continued efforts on this. So many of us are grateful that you will not back down on these issues and keep this discussion at the forefront.
Amen. Absolutely. You're very welcome. And the men and women caught in this are worthy of it. And thank you as well that you continue to work on their behalf. Just, I kind of told a little bit about you, Davis, but just kind of reset for audience again, your history and then why you took on this fight.
Absolutely. So I was in law school when 9/11 happened. So I raised my hand. I joined the United States Air Force, served for 11 years on active duty, left active duty, joined the reserve component. And this fight against the COVID mandate was very personal to me. The Air Force tried to separate me at 19 and a half years. So 6 months shy of a retirement. It took an injunction in federal court that saved me from about 24 hours from losing everything my family and I had worked for over that 20-year period. So this was a fight that the Air Force, I didn't look for it. The Air Force brought it to me, and then I became involved with a group of Navy SEALs and others, and we pushed back against this from the very beginning. And finally, we have an administration that's starting to recognize the concerns we raised when the mandate came down.
Okay. And you have been fighting this out in courts, both civil and military, correct, over the last few years on behalf of servicemen and women?
That's right. And there were two issues that we raised throughout this process that I think are critical to understand because they're finally coming to fruition. The first issue was this was an experimental medical product. It was an emergency use EUA product that was not authorized. You cannot legally mandate it on military members when it's an experimental or EUA product.
Can we pause it right there? Because I think this is an important distinction you're making. I want to highlight for the audience because it is true, military members, they even to the point of giving up your own life, when you enlist, you are saying, I am sacrificing a level of my agency and autonomy for the greater collective, the greater good here of being a member of the armed forces. That's inherent to that, right? Now, it's not unilateral, though. It doesn't mean you don't retain any agency or autonomy, but you do sign over a portion of it. And something that is officially FDA recognized or approved is kind of that dividing line on whether you're the first people we're going to test this on or not. And in the case of the COVID vaccines, the only strain of the COVID vaccines that the FDA formally approved, and everybody saw those headlines, FDA approval, was a strain of it that was actually, and I'm calling it a strain because it's the COVID virus in my opinion, so that's what I'm calling it that for. The only strain of it that FDA approved in our country was a variation that was never for sale or available to the civilian population of this country one time. And so the debate in your neck of the woods is, does that line up? If if the FDA quote unquote approved it, but it was never actually available here on U.S. soil, does that actually meet the threshold of what the CMJ says you can do to me as part of giving up some of my agency as a soldier? Do I have that correct?
That's right. Title 10 of the United States Code was passed by Congress to prevent medical experimentation on military members because there's a history of that in our country. And this was finally done in the 90s. It was very clear federal law. But for the first time, so leading up to this executive order, for the first time, a federal court, the Court of Federal Claims, officially ruled that the medical interchangeability, the bait and switch that Lloyd Austin and the Department of Defense tried to pull on military members was not valid. And that court has ruled that we were correct, that it was an unlawful mandate as it pertains to an experimental virus. That same court, and this is where we get into where we're at now, that same court recognized that at least as far as the Coast Guard, and they're going to be ruling for the other branches of the service shortly, but that they did also violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which does apply to military members and says military members are allowed to apply and should receive a religious accommodation to vaccine requirements as appropriate. So that's where we're at legally, just leading up to this executive order. We finally have a court. It hasn't been with a lot of fanfare. A lot of people haven't been talking about it because it's a court of limited jurisdiction, but a federal court has ruled that the mandate was unlawful and that the Coast Guard violated the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
All right. So that sets the scene here now for the re-election of Donald Trump. And he comes out guns blazing with an onslaught of executive orders, Davis, that I have described as a political version of a large amphibious assault. I mean, he is hitting them on virtually every issue front: cultural, social, political, defense, spending, every front. I mean, he's launched an attack against the left. And on your front in particular, he signed an executive order for some form of restoration of those who lost their standing over the COVID, not a vaccine. Can you tell us exactly what that executive order said?
Right. So that executive order applied to two categories. There's really three categories of military members impacted by the mandate and still dealing with the adverse consequences of it. The executive order addresses two categories. It addresses about 8,600 military members that were involuntarily separated solely because they did not receive the vaccine. That was a number that was kicked out very early on. They were primarily low-ranking enlisted folks who didn't have a choice, didn't have an opportunity, didn't have resources to push back in the courts. And frankly, we couldn't react fast enough to save. So that's 8,600. Those people have been given a clear process to apply for reinstatement. And the executive order directs that they will be able to apply for restoration of time in service. So they'll get, even this missed time, they'll get credit as service time for this period. They will be eligible for back pay and potentially for promotion. So there is an effort, and the clear goal of this policy is to try to make those folks whole as if they had continued in service. That's the first category.
So I have heard from several different people in my audience that are in that group, but I've heard mixed results so far. And I don't even want to begin to describe the positive and the negative because you're the expert here. That's why we brought you on. Okay. So let me just ask this in a general way. Is there a reason in the way the order is either written or it is being carried forth? Like we saw, for example, in his first term, Trump tried to kick all the trainees out of the military and the generals just literally just belayed that order and refused to obey it. Okay. Now, a lot of those generals from the highest rankings are gone, but you still have an entire swampy DOD apparatus there. So is it the order's ambiguity or is it the way that the order is being enforced and carried forth that is causing such mixed reaction amongst some of the military personnel in my audience that are in that group you just described?
I think there's two pieces of it. One is a concern that it will not be carried out properly because it is pushing people into the Board of Corrections for Military Records process, which is a broken process that is highly bureaucratic. So there is a pathway to do this that is I think, going to quickly reveal that pathway is broken and that it's primarily managed by bureaucratic functionaries that are horribly inefficient. So my hope is this will quickly reveal, because there is a monitoring process. These folks are going to have to report to Secretary Hegseth on a 30-day basis. And if the system is not doing what it's supposed to, he's going to have transparency and I hope be able to make some very clear changes. I think that's one level of disappointment is people don't trust the system. The other is the question of accountability. I think there's a lot of us that wish that this executive order had come out the gate and looked to hold accountable and responsible individuals like Lloyd Austin, who pulled a bait and switch on military members.
And if the latter had happened, that would have maybe clarified some of the things in the former, right? Because the agency that you're in, the bureaucracy that you guys are leery of, would be put on blast. right? I mean, there would already be something pointing out there, hey, we're going to hold people accountable. So if you try to gum this up, you try to slow this down or make people, dance with ants in their pants and say that we're sorry 7,000 times before you carry this out, we're watching you, basically.
That's right. And that's what I'm encouraged by when we look at the language, because there is some very helpful language in the guidance that's been pushed out. They haven't called it unlawful, but they have called it unfair and they have called it unjust. And from the perspective of the Board of Corrections, that's the legal standard at the Board of Corrections. So baked into the policy is a solution through the Board of Corrections. The problem is, I practice with I have a lot of cases before the Board of Corrections in all branches of the service right now. And the normal process takes over 2 years to get a resolution. That's not going to work here. So that's where I think we're going to see an opportunity for systemic reform. And I'm excited about that beyond just the COVID cases.
So let's just have you treat us like you're our lawyer here for the final 3 minutes of this interview. All right. How would you advise a veteran in our audience right now to go forth if they haven't begun the process of being restored yet, number one, and then number two, if they have, but they don't like where it's headed or they feel stymied or they're concerned? What would you advise in both cases?
I think we have to flood the Board of Corrections with requests for full restoration. So I think that's what we have to do. Just like we did during COVID, where we pushed back and it was numbers that were valuable, that's what I'd like to see. I would like to see as many people as possible filing requests for reinstatement and full restoration, even if you're still in and you were punished, you weren't promoted or otherwise, and flood the Board of Corrections with these cases so that Secretary Hegseth has a full, accurate picture of everything that happened to all of us and how big the problem is, because once he has that picture, then I think he and the Trump administration can move forward with fixing it.
I also think looking at this the way you do military, I do civilians. Okay. So these guys are facing so many different fronts of pushback and obstinance about any reform on any level at all from the bureaucracy, the political bureaucracy of that department there. And you need to do what Davis just said, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease, because there's only 24 hours a day. They're human beings. And the ones that seem to be the most chronic or acute cases of abuse are going to get their attention, because there's a lot of different fronts, I would imagine, that Pete Hegseth could spend 46 hours a day fighting this level of bureaucracy if he had to.
No, you're absolutely right. And the more cases we get in front, I mean, this could be, there's 8,600 that were involuntarily separated. There's another 95,000 that were forced out of the military because of the COVID mandates. And so those numbers are critical. And again, we can't just give up now. I think we have to put the pressure on the system. You can apply. It doesn't mean you have to agree to go back in and serve. But the more folks that apply, the more pressure we put on the system, we reveal the problem, and they're not going to be able to hide it or continually bury these cases or keep them from Secretary Hegseth or the president.
All right, final thing, Davis. I don't want to, overload you with work, but do you guys have a resource or something? Because you obviously cannot represent all of those people, and there's not a lot of people working in your space. Do you have a resource or something available that people that are in any of those two camps you just mentioned could follow, look to, read, etc., just to help guide them through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone can follow me on X. It's just at Davis Younts. You can reach out to my website. And then also we are still working with Stand With Warriors. StandWithWarriors.org was the organization that was started by pastors during COVID. And Stand With Warriors is getting ready for this fight as well. So they are gearing up resources. Michael Cassidy is going to be involved. He's the guy that tore down the Satan statue.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to be involved with Stand With Warriors on a more regular basis as well. So we're going to continue to push on that front. So StandWithWarriors.org. Stay tuned there for additional information and resources.
All right. Thank you, Davis. And again, you guys need more help. Rocket fuel in this. Don't hesitate to look us up and to ping us. Okay.
All right. Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
You bet. Appreciate you. Thank you. What do you guys think?
There's a real potential silver lining into what I hope is the temporary problem that Davis is dealing with, is that it will out nefarious actors, both in terms of personnel and process, the kind of people and the kind of bureaucratic sludge that is designed not to get anywhere, whether we're talking about this vaccine issue or anything else. So because, like you said, there's only so many hours in a day, kind of, okay, this is what we're going to do here. March. You're going to find those who are like, okay, even if they're like, I'm just marching because I'm marching, I'll follow whatever as you tell me. Or they're the ones who are like, no, I'm totally part of the cult. I'm going to resist this as long as... It's going to be good to know that through this. It's going to be messy. There's no way around that.
Yeah, I think a similar dynamic needs to happen here, is what you were articulating in the first hour, Todd. So yeah, we have this giant retconning about who the COVID not vaccines should have been targeted towards. But what we really need to break through is this still very overt, really on the surface notion, hey, it saved millions upon millions, the magical power of vaccines. That needs to be broken through. And a similar dynamic needs to happen here in the military, where the rank, well, really starting at the top with the leadership, who was in on this, who knew, at least on some level, what this mandate was trying to accomplish, out those people and hopefully excise them as well.
Well said, both of you.
Left to men like Davis Younts fight for these Navy SEALs. Paul Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant.